Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our third cross-cultural training presentation. And I just want to start by introducing or reintroducing Tammy Giroux from Alaska Native Women's Resource Center and Paula Julian from Native Indigenous Women's Resource Center. And we also have a special guest with us as well, Heidi Van Treese. She's the program coordinator from the Organized Village of Cake Domestic Violence Program. We're very lucky to have her join us today. And I'm just really thankful that we have her as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a full hour presentation for you. So thank you again, everybody, for joining.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to talk with you again. This is Tammy Truitt Giroux, and today I'm actually in my homeland. I'm in Degaton Athabascan Territory in Nunavik, home for subsistence. And so hopefully the phone will stay connected. As we know, it's always a challenge, isn't it? But as I've introduced myself before, I'm the executive director for the Resource Center, and I am a citizen of Anvik Tribe. And I've also been working in this field in different capacities for many years. And we are excited today. I don't know if we're excited, but we are going to talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and the impact that it has on children. But I would like to first have both Paula and Heidi introduce themselves. So I'll turn it over to Paula.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Tammy. And good morning, everybody. Wherever you are in Juneau or anywhere in the Southeast. Again, my name is Paula Julian, and I'm a senior policy specialist with the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. And it's really good to be with you all for this third cross-cultural webinar. I will go ahead and turn it over to our special guest, who we're really excited is joining us from the village of Cake in Southeast Alaska. So Heidi?
Good morning, everybody. This is Heidi Van Treese, and I am the Domestic Violence Program Coordinator for the Organized Village of Cake. And I've been working with Tammy and Paula, it seems like for a while, and it's just been an honor to work with them. They're very knowledgeable and they're very helpful, and they've been a great resource to our program. And so I hope everybody learns a lot, because they are movers and shakers in our program, and we're all just working together to try and make a difference and make our state and villages safer for women and children and men, if that be the case. And so I look forward to working with them on this webinar today.
Thank you, Heidi. And we're so glad that Heidi can join us today, as well as we're looking at the July or August webinar as well for Heidi to join us and share the awesome work that she and many others in Cake are doing to address the issue of missing and murdered women and the impact on children, but also doing the work on domestic and sexual violence. So we're sad that we have to do the work, but it is doing the work that gives us hope that we can change this unfortunate reality, and we can do it working together. So it has been awesome for Tammy and I to be working with Heidi, and again, the tribal leadership at Cake, and so many community members there. So I'm going to turn this over to Candy. If she can please do a quick review of how you can use your GoToWebinar control panel. Candy?
Alrighty, good morning, everyone. I'll make this really quick. Just want to highlight, if you guys look at your GoToWebinar control panel, it should be on the right side of your screen. Important sections are 1, the question section. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, that's the section you want to type those in, and we will either answer them as we go or at the end of the webinar, kind of like a question and answer. And if we're not able to get to all of those questions, then we'll respond via email after. And then the second section that I want to highlight is the audio section. So if any point you're experiencing bad audio, go ahead and check that section. You can select phone call option and let it sit there for several seconds, and then go back to audio section, and that will kind of reset your connection for the computer. If you do that and still are having issues with your audio, go ahead and stay on the phone selection and call in via your phone. And then the third section is the chat box section. So if at any point you can chat with any of the presenters, myself, or everybody, if you have questions, question section, but chats are available as well. And that's it. So I hope you guys are having a fantastic morning, and let me know if you have any tech issues throughout the webinar.
Thank you, Candy.
Thank you, Candy.
And we are recording, so just wanting to remind everyone, and I think Becky has been making the recording available to staff, especially those who are not able to join us. So with that, I'll hand it over to Tammy for the agreements.
Good morning again. And we spoke about this last time, and I want to acknowledge that these agreements were adapted and were first actually the brainchild of First Alaskans. And so we want to make sure that we acknowledge their, that they've allowed us to borrow some of these, so to speak. But I think that first of all, I think that we need to understand that missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives is a really heavy topic, and it can trigger different things for different people. And I think we just need to be very aware of that, because it's just something that, like Paula said earlier, and I've spoke of too, is that it's not a new issue, but it's a long-standing issue that has impacted Indigenous communities for many, many years for a lot of different reasons. And we've spoken about some of those in the previous webinars. But I just want you all to be aware. Taking care of yourself and taking care of each other is part of that agreement. And remember that in every chair there's a leader. That means in every chair we each have our own strengths that we bring to the table. And we speak to be understood, and we listen to understand. We may not necessarily always agree, but we at least work to be respectful in that. Be present, be engaged. We can value this short time we have together. I'm going to go ahead and say this, but I would like Paula to expand on this when we get done. Brave space is for meaningful conversation. And remember, yes, there's many challenges, but there's also solutions. Take a style hats off. And I think we talked about this last time, is that we all wear a number of hats, whatever that might be. Take this moment in time to possibly take all those hats off so that we can again be open in this space. The value of humor, it helps us. And we are ourselves responsible for whatever experience we get from this. And just before I turn it over to Paula, is that the agreements are really in the context of the, social justice or change or education or at least dialogue. So sometimes there's going to be conflict or disagreement. And it's not, we don't necessarily want to avoid that, but it's a natural outcome of being in a diverse group of people. We're not going to all agree about everything on every aspect of a subject. And so we recognize that, we acknowledge that so that we can move forward. And supporting ourselves and each other is really important. So Paula, would you go ahead and talk a little bit about the Brave Space?
Thank you, Tammy. And I want to share a little bit about Brave Space. I'm not sure, I can't recall if I shared it last month, but I also want to share it in the context of Search's. I don't know if this is Search's, part of Search's philosophy, but I think it sounds like it was very much part of the foundation for Search, and that is your book is titled Gumboot Determination, and it fits really well with this concept of brave space, that as we explore the content that we have been through these webinars, that it may push us, and it should push us to the edge of our comfort zones, and that's for purposes of maximizing our learning, and hopefully making the work that you all do at Search and the work that we do, that Heidi does in CAKE and Tammy and I do as resource centers, really look at full and truthful engagement, that we agree that we can have some controversial discussions, and we do that with civility, which is different than the usual agree to disagree mantra. So it's controversy with civility. We understand that the sources of disagreement, and that we work cooperatively toward common solutions, and inspire courage in the face of conflict. And again, as Tammy said, really push and continue the dialogue process. So as Search begins to wrap up this project this year, around specialized services for abused parents and their children, really thinking about how with your gumboot determination, you can continue to push ahead and think about how to respond to victims of domestic violence, abused parents and their children in new and creative ways, and in ways that are truly going to meet the health and social service needs of those coming through your doors, especially given that we know that there are not enough services, particularly for Native women, but for all victims of domestic and sexual violence. I think that's true nationwide, and it's definitely true in rural communities and for Native victims. I don't know if Heidi has anything she wants to add to this agreements.
No, I don't, Paula.
Okay, great. So then we're gonna just do a quick review of our goal for today's hour-long webinar. And that is to begin to understand the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, including the intersection of domestic violence, the impacts on and the resilience of children and families, and how, again, can Search respond. Hopefully in new ways, digging deep in terms of your creativity, and the rich cultural heritage that is there in the Southeast. I want to share that this picture in the top left corner is a flyer of a young woman from CAKE who was found earlier this year, but wanting to again put faces to faces and names to these issues, because we know that it's not just about what we find in research, in books, but it's also what's going on and impacting abused parents and their children on the ground. So this is Shirley Skeek, and she was found, and I don't recall what's happening with the case. I don't know if they've made any arrests, but she was found earlier this year. So just wanting to honor Shirley and remember her, and again, hopefully make sure that this doesn't continue to happen. So with the next couple of slides are really helping us to understand the crisis. So I think in previous webinars, especially in the first and second webinars, we talked about the roots of domestic violence, including missing and murdered, coming from colonization. We talked about various reports and provided links on the resources page to various federal documents like the Indian Law and Order Commission 2013 report, the Civil Rights Commission's 2018 Broken Promises report, and the 2009 federal apology that President Obama and Congress made in 2009 to Native Americans, recognizing the violence, maltreatment, neglect inflicted on Native peoples that the U.S. was apologizing for. So again, just making it clear that that in terms of understanding domestic violence and missing murdered, we have to understand it as coming from that disruption, as some would call colonization. And that colonization, has resulted in misunderstandings about tribal governments and sovereignty and tribal authority to be able to protect their own, as well as a lack of support for resources, which Search is all too familiar with. And part of the reason why Native people organized to create Search with their gumboot determination to ensure that health services were provided in as equitable a manner as possible for Alaska Native, particularly Southeast Native people. So one, just, this and the next couple of slides is really just providing that context, that the root is seen in the disparities in the statistics that you have on the screen against Native women. So in 2017, CDC found homicide is the 6th leading cause of death for Native females, ages 1 through 44. In some tribal communities, women are murdered at a rate 10 times higher. Native women are murdered and go missing at a higher rate than any other ethnic group. And again, missing and murdered falls within a spectrum of violence committed against Native women. And that spectrum includes, as far as healthcare services, it includes the sterilization of Native women that occurred in the 70s under Indian Health Services guidance, I guess you could say. So that's just a little bit about that. I don't know if Tammy and Heidi want to share anything specific as far as Southeast Native women or Alaska Native women at large.
I have something. Heidi, did you want to say anything at this point?
Just that I've lived in Cake most of my life, and I grew up, we've had at least 7, I want to say, MMIW cases, and like most of the last 3 recent ones were young ladies. And so most of these, some of them didn't happen in my lifetime, but like the last 3 were young women that I knew. And so I'm sadly too well aware of MMIW and the statistics and how real and devastating it is, and the long lasting effects it can have on a community and children. And so a lot of my work stems from personal experience. And so if I talk about it, it's from the heart and it's very real and it's something we're still living with. So
Thank you, Heidi. And this is Tammy, and it's a sad testament. I've lived in Anvik for the last almost 30 years, and I just recently moved into the city, or what we consider the city, I guess, Fairbanks. And but I remember almost every time, either my nieces or my daughters, even my sons, my nephews, that I would say to them, okay, I'd have to warn them before they went to Anchorage on whether it was a school trip, whether we were there for other kinds of trips, that, just exactly the dangers that they might face, that not to talk to certain people, not to go to certain places, not to be alone, even in the lobby of the hotel. I mean, these are the kinds of warnings that I would give my young people, because we knew, even just going into Anchorage or Fairbanks or wherever it ends up that we were going, that it was just it was dangerous. And trying to explain that to 13, 14, 15-year-olds who think that the world is kind of open, and you don't have to be, you're not afraid of anything. So I think these are the kinds of lived experiences that it's a part of our daily life. Just like having to warn your son not to, if you get pulled over by a police officer, to be very respectful, be very careful. But these are the kinds of things that are part of being an Indigenous person or Alaska Native person in our state. And that it's a real thing, whether we have a danger in our home communities, because that also can be, there can be danger there as well. So that's all I'm going to say about that, Paula.
Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Heidi. And listening to the two of you reminds me of conversations that that we've had, many of us during conferences, after hours, talking about the reality that for Native women, it's not a question, and Native girls, it's not a question of whether or not they're going to experience domestic or sexual violence. Or if they're going to go missing or be murdered. Unfortunately, it's more a question of how many times. So, as we're talking about, Tammy, your teachings that you have to make sure that you give to women and your young about being careful and being mindful. It's a reality that shouldn't be, but and not a but. And I think that with different people and organizations working together, including health services, especially including health and social services, I think we know that we can make a difference and we can change that so that we don't have to continue to do that for our future generations. So I just appreciate, you both sharing your perspectives. So then this slide that we have here, titled Intersection of Domestic Violence with Missing and Murdered. Again, I think given the statistics and research, we know that domestic violence is a leading cause of homicide for Alaska Native women. And we know, we're going to talk about it in a couple slides from here, that the impact, as Heidi shared from her experience and from many others, the impact of this type of violence is devastating for children, families, and communities. And we also know from having Heidi with us that as devastating as it is, that people survive and thrive and are able to bounce back, with their resiliency and really come up with some creative solutions and responses. I'm going to turn this over to Tammy, but we also know that at the most dangerous time for victims of domestic violence is when they leave and separate from the abuser. And unfortunately, this is when we see cases of abductions and homicide, including homicide suicides. And so I'm going to turn this over to Tammy to talk about that a little bit more.
Hi, this is Tammy again. And I want to talk about this because I think that this is where it's not always, not everyone jumps from missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls to domestic violence. Yet, the missing and murdered, a lot of about what is happening to Indigenous women and girls that are murdered is about domestic violence or about violence in relationships in whatever form that looks like. And that makes sense when we talk about the high levels of lethality that happen in danger that happen in domestic violence types of relationships. And so it's really important that we do make the connection because it's a huge piece of the murdered piece of this. Now, missing is another aspect to this, and oftentimes, many times, if a person goes missing, there's not always, we see stories on TV and other places about how a person just walks away from their life and they disappear into the world, and that may be happening. Unfortunately, in this situation, oftentimes when an Indigenous woman or girl goes missing, it's usually for, what's that word, nefarious or for suspicious reasons, whether it's because the woman, that person has been abducted and something bad has happened to her. But there's a lot of, unfortunately, there's a lot of that happens as well. And I wanted to talk more about the lethality scales. And I don't know if any of you have ever heard about lethality scales. I'm sure that you have, especially in mental health, you have assessments of harm, basically, if a person is going to do themselves harm or if they're going to harm someone else. So you have scales of kind of measuring that kind of behavior. Well, in domestic violence, there is what they call a lethality or an danger assessment scale. And the main place that this was developed was by Dr. Jacqueline Campbell from Johns Hopkins School of Nursing. And there was a lot of studies that were done, research studies that were done on femicide that identified 20 lethality factors that are in play in violence in terms of the escalation of violence. That includes threats to kill. And this is a really important risk factor because oftentimes when a fight escalates, in the heat of the moment, threats will be made, whether that's threats to harm you in some way or kill you. Those have to be taken seriously. Strangulation, we know that strangulation happens in about 50% of the domestic violence cases. And when strangulation is used, it's extremely dangerous and it hires the person's, it's a higher threat to that person that's being strangled. Access to a gun, that's a question we often ask. And of course, in our small tribal communities and in Alaska in general, and probably in a lot of homes around the United States, guns are a common thing to have in a home. Threatening to kill themselves. This is often a threat that is done in the heat of those moments, is that the perpetrator or the abuser will threaten to kill themselves to keep control of the situation or to keep that person there and to try to control with guilt or whatever that might be that the person feels. And then there's another piece that is, this one is one that trying to explain, particularly to younger girls, the whole idea of extreme and constant jealousy. You know, in our society, we have all these kind of painted pictures about how, you know, being jealous or, you know, that's how much I love you. It's showing that kind of love. It's kind of showing that you're paying attention. It's kind of promoted almost in a way, or at least that's what I hear from a lot of people. Oh, he just loves me so much. He just doesn't want me to talk to other people. But extreme and constant jealousy is actually a control and is also very much a rating on a lethality scale. Why this is important is because through all the research and through much experience since the early 80s, the lethality scales are being used and adapted from the original one that Dr. Campbell had provided through her research in a lot of advocacy programs, in a lot of domestic violence programs. For instance, a lot of times if you're talking, if a person is connected to an advocate, they will go ahead and the advocate, even if they're not asking the questions, will through their head as they're listening to this person is probably measuring the lethality of the situation. Because what that impacts is, especially if a person is going into a program, it impacts people around them as well because of the danger that can pose for anyone that might be around the victim. It also helps to determine how best to possibly serve that person. Now, I think that we supplied a copy of what we call the Walking the Path Together tools. And this was a danger assessment that the original one with Dr. Campbell that was developed with Walking the Path Together with some domestic violence organizations through the Alberta Council on Women's Shelters, which is in Canada. And so I'm just going to use the word, it indigenized it to some degree, which helped a lot of the tribal programs be able to assess folks when they come through the door. One of the things I just want to go ahead and really quickly go over is that from the Violence Policy Center and their 6th edition of the American Roulette, Murder-Suicide in the United States, the findings include of 296 murder-suicides in the first half of 2017, 270 or 91% were known to involve a firearm. So of course that increases the lethality. 65% of the murder-suicide involved an intimate partner. Of these, 96% were females killed by their intimate partners. Among the incidences where females were killed by intimate partners, 94% involved a gun. Most of the killers in murder-suicides were men. Of the 296 suicides, 263 or 89% were male, 19% were female, and 14 were not unidentified. They were not identified by gender. And most of the murder-suicide victims were women. Of the 367 homicide victims, 253 or 69% were female, and 99 or 26 or 27% were male, and 15 were not identified by gender. 42 of the homicide victims were children and teens less than 18 years of age. 82% of the murder-suicides occurred in the home, and of the murder-suicides involving a male murderer and 3 or more victims, 55% were perpetrated by family annihilators, murderers who kill their intimate partners and their children before killing themselves. And these are, I mean, I don't even like to read these because it's a sad and terrible thing that has happened, and oftentimes it's perpetrated by what we have been talking about the lethality of situations, particularly in domestic violence, in family violence, and how that's impacting both victims, the perpetrators, of course, but the children. And I think that that's really what we are trying to get across here, and talk about when we talk about MMIW. So I'm going to turn the next slide over to Paula, please.
Thank you, Tammy. This next slide, I'm not going to go through the statistics, but the rates of federal handling of these cases, including from federal law enforcement and prosecution, again, is reflective of vulnerabilities unique to Native women that no other group or ethnicity of women in the United States have to face. And so it is, we know that there are organizing efforts across the country that are working to change local and state responses to domestic violence and to missing and murdered cases of all people, but in this instance, particularly of Native women. So we know that, there is this organizing to do that. And I always like to say the federal government and the federal response is not also needing to reform their responses, that the same barriers we see in local and state responses in terms of not understanding the issue. For example, if there is alcohol involved, we have seen locally, statewide, and in the federal response that these cases that involve alcohol are much more challenging in terms of holding abusers accountable and really protecting the victims, because there tends to be the perception that, well, we can't prove who in fact was victimized, and that if the abusers or offenders were also using, that they actually knew what they were doing. So we know at the local, state, and also at the federal level, based on the handling by law enforcement and prosecution, we know that there's going to most likely not be that safety and accountability that we would like to see. And so the first statement at the top of this slide, vulnerability of Native women is due in large part to the lack of legal consequences. And so this is where, well, then, what else can we do? We can continue to work to reform the criminal justice system at the state, local, state, and federal level. But in the meantime, as some of our advocates say, in the meantime, how can we meet the other needs, the non-justice related needs of women and their children, so that they don't fall through the cracks, and women and girls don't go missing or murdered. And, we can hopefully prevent any more of these from happening. But if they do happen, then how can we respond? And this is where search and the health services that you all provide can really help to fill that gap, and really help to address these other needs that women and children have. And I think this is what we'll go to the next couple of slides, and I'll turn this back over to Tammy and Heidi. But this is where, I think, again, searches services, and making sure that you are available to create these important spaces for people to be able to share their experiences and be believed and be supported cannot be understated. So Tammy?
The next slide, it shows you a couple of quotes and some pictures. And the picture on the bottom left, as we face it, is Linda Guthrie with two of her 4 grandsons that she's raising. And the children's mother, Linda's daughter, Judy Lee, was murdered in 2016 by her boyfriend in Clark. And it, again, extremely tragic, and left these children basically without their parents. Luckily, they have a loving grandmother and grandfather and other family members that are able to support them. But it's still it's a terrible loss to have to live with. And in the upper right-hand corner is a picture of Mackenzie Howard's mother, Marla Howard, from Cape. And this was taken in 2019 and during a memorial. I'm not going to try to say the word because I will not. Kui, I think is how you say it, but I'm going to have Heidi could possibly correct me. But a memorial or ceremonial party for her 5 years after Mackenzie's murder in 2013. And the quote made no sense, was from the father of Mackenzie, the murder of his daughter. And down below this is that the system is broken. I lost my daughter, and I know my granddaughters face the same danger. We all do. That just makes me want to cry. It truly chokes me up and makes me want to cry, because I feel that too often this is a story that we hear. And the understanding the resilience of children and families and tribes and communities that continue to survive and live their best lives. And it can be seen in the range of the types of responses. Linda moved her grandchildren and her family temporarily to Hawaii after Judy Lee's murder. And Marla and her family, including those who came in from Juneau organizing. And Heidi, you may have to correct me on this. Kui, is that how you say it?
Hi, Tammy. It's pronounced Kui, and I know the X in that is really hard to pronounce if you're not Tlingit or if you're not familiar. So the Kui was a party, as a way for the family to honor Mackenzie, and that usually takes about a year to plan, and we were able to participate in that. And the DB program was also honored with a button blanket made by various people in Cake, and Marla wanted to honor our program and say thank you for the work that we do. And that, just looking at that picture, it's heartbreaking, because I know Marla, and just to read the quote, the system is broken and it's frustrating, and offender accountability in Alaska for MMIW it seems like there's a strong lack of offender accountability. And so just this slide is particularly heartbreaking, and you just know that it's still going on. And but there are people working on the ground, working to make a difference, to work with kids and families, and the impacts are ongoing. It's not just once the payoff party or memorial is done, that there are still long-term residual effects on the community and kids and adults as well. And so the need is there for help.
Thank you, Heidi. And I think that we know that these are powerful statements and powerful pictures, because grief stays with us. We oftentimes we have to learn to live with it, but it stays with us. And I wanted to share something. We've done a couple of walks and organized MMIW walks in Fairbanks in the last few years. Last year, of course, with COVID, we didn't do that. There was a virtual event. But at every walk that we've been at, whether it was in Juneau, whether it was in Cake, whether it was in Fairbanks, whether it was in Anchorage, we have people coming forward, and those people oftentimes are adult children are victims that have been murdered or have gone missing. And I can remember poignantly listening to a young man. He's a young man in his 30s, and he came forward, and it's the first time he ever shared. I think it was 3 years ago, here or in Fairbanks, and at the walk-in, telling about how his mother had been killed by his father, and the terror and the pain that had imprinted on his life and had guided his life, both sometimes negatively in terms of some of the things he got into as a young person. Fortunately, he was doing something different got sober and was doing something different as a young adult. But that being said, his life was still very much guided by that terrible event that happened to him, and also guided him as a father. He was a very dedicated father, and so I think that we cannot minimize at all the impacts, even if it's not directly in the child's family in our communities, but our relatives, the impact on our children in terms of how they are being affected. And so going into the next slide, talking about, Shirley Moses is the executive director of Healing Native Hearts Coalition and Interior Coalition for Tribal Coalition. And she has stated several times, and children are our first responders. Children are the witnesses to things that we never witness or we never understand or see in our homes. And children are the least prepared to be those responders because of just brain development, just all kinds of other areas that, that children are supposed to be growing and learning and experiencing. And so you have to understand that children often then live in fear after witnessing violence. Or they end up having to be raised by grandparents. And that's not a bad thing. At least they may have other family members, or they end up in foster systems. Unresolved grief. And I don't know about you, but I know that unresolved grief can be a very long-lasting emotion that can impact many areas of your life. Living with the secrecy. Feelings of abandonment. Adults that, aren't talking with children, so children having to form their own opinions. I often tell this story. When I was a little girl, I don't remember how old. I remember many times where my mom and my aunts or my grandma, they would be sitting around the table having coffee or tea or whatever they were doing and chatting, and the kids would all be playing and being wild or whatever, and all of a sudden it would get really quiet at the table, and their voices at the table would get into like whispers. And what they were talking about are my two aunts, the one that was murdered by her husband and the other one that went missing and was taken off near a reservation that they lived out in the Washington area. And all of us kids, of course, as soon as the whispers started, we all wanted to know. So we're all listening. We didn't understand what was going on until much later. But that was that whole idea of secrecy and adults not explaining to children what that is. And I just I want to turn this over to Heidi to talk about some of the resiliency and some of the activities that particularly CAIC is doing, but that other communities can also do as well. And just before I turn it over is that, this can also impact our health and our educational outcomes. It's a direct link to the suicide rates that we often that children experience with that continued trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder. And so with all of those kind of heavy things, I do want Heidi to talk about some of the proactive kinds of things that are helping in their community working with children. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. I will say when I first started my job in 2011, I was a DV advocate, and our program was fairly new. And um, we we were involved with the Mackenzie Howard case. And as a DV advocate, I remember going to a training in Anchorage, and they started talking about sexual assault and vicarious trauma. And I remember we watched a video on the vicarious trauma, and unbeknownst to me, I was experiencing PTSD and the vicarious trauma from that without even knowing what it was. And as soon as I watched that video, I remember I started crying, and I just told him, I said, "That is me." I said, I'm right there right now. And I share that to say a lot of the kids are experiencing a lot of this here without even recognizing what they're going through, and the community and first responders and the family members. And so a lot of good things have come from the tragedies that have happened in Cake. And so the programs that we are going in Cake have been led and sustained by volunteers. And so there are a lot of good people on the ground. And you hear that quote, look for the helpers. And there are a lot of helpers in Cake. We have a lot of good programs. And a few slides back, there was a video of the high school girls that I work with, and they had their arms up in the Rosie the Riveter pose, we can do it. And that program came from one of the young girls back several years ago. There's a program in Cake that's been ongoing called Coaching Boys into Men, and it's a prevention program that addresses the violence against women in Alaska, and it just teaches young men about healthy relationships, healthy attitudes towards women. And so the program I work with, the girls, the girl in the back right, you can see her. She came up to us after the Coaching Boys into Men had their first public ceremony of how they won't condone violence, unhealthy attitudes towards women. She came up to us and said, "Where's the girls program?" And so we worked, and we were looking all over for prevention programs for girls, and there weren't any. And so we looked for a while, and we had another death of a young woman. And I said, you know what, we can't wait anymore. We can't wait for someone to come up with a program. We're working with the girls. And so we adapted the curriculum the boys were using for the girls, and it was very relevant. And so this year, I think, will be our 4th or 5th year working with the girls. And so we meet with them once a week from 30 minutes to an hour over the course of 3 to 4 months. And so a lot of these girls have been through, we've worked with them every year now. Most of them worked with us throughout their entire high school. And so it's about building long-term relationships with them and just knowing that you're there with them. And we have a lot of prevention programs in Cake that I can't brag enough about the people that want to make a difference and make sure that our kids are healthy and safe. And there's the Boys Run, which is led by SAFE out of Sitka. And then we have the school that leads Girls on the Run. And our DP program does the Discovering Equality program, which the girls named. And you can see in the picture, their T-shirts. And we have the high school basketball coach who spearheaded the Coaching Boys into Men program, which is they're going into their, I want to say 8th year of working with the young men. And my husband also volunteers. And so a lot of the people are volunteers in working with the kids, and they give their time to work with them and just to be a positive role model, positive mentor, and just to be a friend and a leader to these kids. And so there are a lot of people working on the ground to make a difference. And a lot of them, they aren't doing it for the recognition, but because they, sad to say, we know the long-term effects of domestic violence and sexual assault and substance abuse and all these other things. And we're just trying to help break cycles and change things in our villages so the future generations are healthy mentally. Behavioral health is really needed, and we look for ways to partner with our behavioral health specialists, and it's just very important. We're all working to make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. And I think that in and of itself says about the community being able to be a part of the solution. It may not solve it instantly, as we know, but by acknowledging it and getting kids involved, because I think that oftentimes kids may feel forgotten, but they really are kind of almost the fabric that keeps many of our communities alive. So I am going to turn over the next slide to Paula.
Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Heidi. And we're coming up to the end of our webinar. We might go over a few minutes, but I just want to, summarize some of what Heidi and Tammy just shared in terms of the ways, some of the ways that SEARCH can recognize and support tribal efforts to strengthen the health and safety networks, particularly for children. It would be supporting tribal events with SEARCH staff that could help debrief the advocates and really encourage and support that self-care. Encouraging, long-term staffing at SEARCH to maximize community members trusting in SEARCH, participating in community events so that SEARCH becomes and is a trusted community member, and then culturally appropriate preventive therapies that I think SEARCH has made available through its services. And again, as I was reading through the Gumboot determination, some of the things that stood out for me were things that SEARCH has done in the past in terms of taking the care to the people rather than making the people come to the care. There's a story about SEARCH and the struggle to attain first adequate health care, but more recently excellence in healthcare, incorporating into the matrix of care the wisdom to be found in, again, the rich cultural traditions of Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian people in the Southeast. And the bottom line is not taking no for an answer, that there is nothing more that SEARCH could do to help address the issue of missing and murdered and domestic and sexual violence. That, as Heidi said at the opening of this webinar, is really taking a toll on the communities. That, for a village the size of Cake or Klawak or any of the other communities in the Southeast, that one murder, one abduction is too much, let alone anything like 7 or more. So it really is going to take all of us working together to really see a difference and make a difference, as SEARCH has done in the past with tuberculosis and other issues. So here's some resources on this slide. And I realize that the only other thing that's missing here that some of you may know is Amber Webb is a local Native woman in Alaska who has a Kuspuk project. And if you haven't seen it, I encourage you all to look it up. I think she has one of her Kuspuks, and she's drawn faces of missing and murdered Alaskan Native women on the Kuspuk. I think there's one on display in a museum in Anchorage. With that, that, I want to thank you all for joining. Thank you to Becky, to our special guest Heidi, Tammy, and the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. And I will see if Tammy has or Heidi have any final closing comments.
I would just say
All I
thank
want to
you.
say is, oh, go ahead.
No, that's fine. I was just going to say thank you to everyone who spoke today, and a special thank you to Heidi for being with us today. I do very much appreciate that. And again, thank you to Paula and Tammy for the continued information and everything that they bring. So thank you all for being with us today.
Thank you very much. I know we're over time, and so I'll leave it at that. But thank you for listening today, and I think we'll be talking to you in about a month.
Heidi?
Thank you for the invite and thanks for listening.
And again, thank you to everybody. Think about how you can bravely help to speak the truths on these issues and work with us to organize for change. Have a beautiful Thursday. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.